This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi, I'm Emilia Leese, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan podcast, a companion to our book, also entitled Think Like a Vegan. Whenever people talk about the environment or the plight of animals, they all seem to say something like, "Oh, I agree, industrial animal farming is terrible." And that's true, it is terrible. Whether from the scale of the exploitation and death, to the conditions in which the animals are forced to live in, to its ludicrously damaging environmental impact, loss of biodiversity, and Victorian labor practices, vegans and non-vegans align in opposing this monstrous industry. What I want to focus on is shifting our attention away from the evils of factory farming and focusing more on the inherent injustice of animal use that's really at the heart of the problem. And I'll do that with a couple of stories and even some archaeology. Most non-vegans see the obvious blight of industrial agribusiness. They've seen and heard so much about the terrible conditions in large-scale farming, including from vegan activists, but they still believe in the myth of good, small farms. They're unable to identify the fundamental problem, which is objectifying animals for exploitation and slaughter, but preferably nicely, you know. And this is the dynamic we need to change. We need to be explicit. It's the relationship that's morally flawed before we get into how animals are treated by either big or small agribusinesses, because the difference between industrial and small agribusiness is merely scale. Here's two stories about how these interactions usually go. An acquaintance who's active in labor unions asked me about veganism. I did nothing to prompt this question, I promise. Really, seriously. And with genuine and true concern in their voice, they, like so many others, declared from the get-go, he thought we should get rid of industrial agriculture because it's terrible. I said, of course it's terrible, as long as we're only focusing on scale. What do you mean? He said. I replied as you'd expect. Animals aren't objects and they have a right to their life. It's only the scale of the two practices which is different. The functions and end results of each industrial or small farming are exactly the same. There's objectification, exploitation, and then there's death. I asked my acquaintance whether they'd be okay with labor exploitation on a small scale, like, for example, serfdom. And of course they weren't. But it didn't occur to them the problem was in the actual relationship we have with other animals. And you know what? I've had this type of conversation many times with similar outcomes. Still, I am always surprised. And here's a second story. I watched a street activist talk to a pig farmer. After showing them horrific footage, the farmer was completely unmoved. They said their pigs were treated well and unlike those in the footage. The activist asked the farmer whether their pigs had names and whether they cared about them. The farmer said yes. Then the activist asked if they had any compunction about their pigs being killed. The farmer insisted they didn't because they knew their pigs were treated well. There was no connection at all made to the principle we shouldn't be using them in the first place. So what's the problem? After all, objectification, death, and exploitation are the same for all those who are at the receiving end. So why do people not see this obvious point too? We'll explore that question just after this musical break. This is Matthew Gerstenberger's Waiting for Summer. Matthew says, I grew up with my late father playing banjo, and I also learned to play later in life. It still has a special meaning for me. The piece also includes some of his father's drums, which might be a little difficult to pick out in this short version. The bird you'll hear is a ruru that sometimes lives in his backyard. They are a really cool little owl he recommends we read about. Check out Matthew's other work as Seismicity on SoundCloud. I believe the lack of understanding is a result of insufficient rhetoric. Animal welfare rhetoric fails to convey everyone, including animals, is entitled to basic fairness. Welfare rhetoric also fails to convey all animal exploitation is bad and has been since the human species began farming 10,000 years ago, whether it's done on a big or small scale, nicely or in horrifying conditions. Same things. And these two failures make it easy for most people to distinguish between a mythological idea of farming animals and the current evil of industrial scale, when this is a distinction without a substantive difference. Obviously, there's a difference of scale and there's a difference of suffering. The myth is this: the past was nice for animals, but really, it was as much hell for them then as it is now, in every way but quantum. And slight sidetrack here, it's never been just about animals. Wherever we have animal exploitation, there's people being exploited too. This is true today and in the past too. Human and animal exploitation coexist because once we make the distinction someone, and that's animal or human someone, doesn't have a right to basic fairness, then we can easily apply it wherever and however we want. You might think this type of human and animal exploitation is a relatively modern concept, but it's not. Even archaeological discoveries from the ancient world show it was the norm. Let's quickly go to Pompeii in southern Italy, a place very dear to my heart and where I've spent a lot of time. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE destroyed the ancient city. Recent excavations have uncovered a dwelling which was divided in a few sections, which was pretty much standard for the time. One section was dedicated to a fine residential area with sophisticated murals, and the other section was a dedicated productive area, which in this case housed a grain mill and a bread bakery. From the archaeologist's descriptions, the grain mill rooms of this ancient dwelling are prison-like. They're situated off an internal atrium and they don't have a roadside exit. Air and light only come from small windows with iron bars. There's also a deep channel surrounding the millstone. So from the physical evidence, and also supported by writings from the time, archaeologists believe these type of mills functioned 24 hours a day. They were powered by blindfolded donkeys who were tied to ropes and forced to walk in an endless circle around the stone mill, which is why there's that deep channel I mentioned before that the archaeologists found around the millstone. And while toiling away, the donkeys received regular beatings. And the people living with and managing the donkeys were themselves wretched and exploited enslaved people. They too worked all day and all night, milling grain and making bread, while living with chains, being barely clothed or fed, and beaten and imprisoned. Here we have animal and human exploitation side by side. And heck, capitalism hadn't even been invented. There was no good animal exploitation in 79 CE, and there still isn't now. There never will be. It's also worth noting these ancient people and animals were making bread, which is the most basic of vegan-friendly products. This should remind us exploitation continues to exist even in contemporary plant foods farming and product manufacturing. We owe it to all those exploited to improve our rhetoric by being clear exploitation is always bad, whether it's a few or many. We need to steer the conversation away from the size of farms to challenging animal use as the acceptable norm. That needs to be the conversation. As vegans, we're the ones at the forefront of these conversations. And it's during these conversations we can be advocates for a fairer world for animals, and by extension, everyone. It's there we have the chance to advance the conversation and shift perceived notions. I urge you, be that advocate.
When we go round, we burn things up. When we go round, we speed things up. When we go round and around.
That's it from me, Emi Leese. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com. You can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.